The morning of March 23, 1944, dawned gray and bitter over the English countryside, but inside the cockpit of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Brick" Romano could feel sweat beating beneath his leather flight helmet, despite the bone-chilling cold at 28,000 feet. Below him, stretched across the German landscape like a wounded steel serpent, flew what remained of the 351st Bomb Group, 18 B-17 Flying Fortresses, limping home from their disastrous raid on Schweinfurt, their formation shattered, their escort fighters long since turned back according to standard operating procedure. The radio crackled in his headset with the voice of his squadron commander, ordering all remaining P-47s to return to base immediately. Fuel was running critically low, and German fighters were massing for what intelligence indicated would be the largest coordinated attack of the war. Romano's hand hovered over his throttle, torn between absolute military discipline and something deeper, something that would not let him abandon those bombers to certain destruction. The mathematical reality was brutal. His remaining fuel gave him perhaps 15 minutes of combat time before he would be forced to crash land in enemy territory. But those 18 bombers carried 162 airmen, men with wives and children, and futures that hung in the balance of his next decision. No one in the 56th Fighter Group knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the tactical doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces and transform the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt from a high-altitude interceptor into the most feared ground attack aircraft in military history, earning it a reputation that would haunt German pilots for the remainder of the war. Francis Romano had been born into the kind of working-class Italian-American family that built America one brick at a time, the son of a stonemason in Providence, Rhode Island, where the smell of ocean salt mixed with the dust of construction sites and the dreams of immigrants who believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. His father, Giuseppe Romano, had arrived at Ellis Island in 1918 with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable faith that his children would achieve what the old country had never allowed him to imagine. And young Francis absorbed those lessons through countless hours spent hauling stone and mixing mortar, learning that precision and patience were the twin pillars upon which all lasting achievements were built. When he enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, just 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Francis carried with him not just his father's work ethic, but an intuitive understanding of machinery that had been honed through years of maintaining the family's ancient truck and helping neighbors repair everything from water pumps to radio sets. Skills that would prove invaluable when he encountered the massive, complex beast that was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. His initial training at Luke Field in Arizona revealed a natural aptitude for flying that surprised his instructors. Romano possessed an almost mystical ability to feel what his aircraft was telling him, to sense when an engine was running hot or when the controls felt mushy in a way that indicated an impending stall, and, more importantly, he demonstrated an aggressive streak that manifested in his willingness to push both himself and his aircraft far beyond what the manual recommended. During advanced gunnery training at Nellis, Romano consistently outscored pilots with twice his experience, not through superior marksmanship, but through his ability to position his aircraft in ways that gave him split-second advantages over his targets, and his instructors began to whisper that here was a natural-born fighter pilot who understood that air combat was less about following prescribed tactics and more about adapting to the chaotic reality of aerial warfare. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for hundreds of Allied airmen flying deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt that Romano first encountered at Bradley Field in Connecticut in the autumn of 1942 was a monster among fighter aircraft, weighing nearly 8 tons when fully loaded and powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower, making it the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter in service with any Air Force in the world. While other pilots complained about its bulk and compared it unfavorably to the sleek, nimble P-51 Mustang, Romano immediately recognized in the Thunderbolt's massive frame and overwhelming firepower the same qualities he had admired in his father's approach to construction: solid, dependable, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment, while delivering devastating results through sheer determination and superior engineering. The aircraft's 850 caliber machine guns, mounted 4 to each wing, could deliver a withering barrage of firepower that could literally tear apart enemy aircraft, and its robust construction meant that it could survive battle damage that would doom lighter fighters. But what truly set the P-47 apart was its superb high-altitude performance, courtesy of an advanced turbo-supercharger system that allowed it to maintain its power output at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air like drowning men. Romano spent countless hours studying every system, every control, every nuance of the Thunderbolt's behavior, learning to exploit its strengths while compensating for its weaknesses, and gradually developing an almost telepathic connection with his aircraft that would prove crucial when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death in the unforgiving skies over Europe. By the time the 56th Fighter Group deployed to England in early 1943, Romano had logged more training hours in the P-47 than any other pilot in his squadron, but he understood that all the training in the world could not fully prepare him for the brutal reality of aerial combat against veteran German pilots flying some of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. What he could not have anticipated was how his deep understanding of the Thunderbolt's capabilities would eventually lead him to develop innovative tactics that would revolutionize the role of fighter aircraft in modern warfare. The strategic bombing campaign that brought Romano and his P-47 to the skies over Nazi Germany was born from the unwavering belief of American military planners that precision daylight bombing could cripple the German war machine by destroying key industrial targets. But by the spring of 1944, that strategy was proving catastrophically expensive in both aircraft and human lives, with bomber losses reaching unsustainable levels despite increasingly desperate measures to protect the formations. The Luftwaffe had adapted to Allied tactics with deadly efficiency, concentrating their fighters at strategic points along bomber routes and launching coordinated attacks that could destroy entire formations in minutes. And German pilots like Adolf Galland and Gunther Röhl had perfected techniques for breaking through fighter escorts and reaching the vulnerable bombers with devastating effectiveness. Allied intelligence estimated that German fighter strength had actually increased during the first quarter of 1944, despite months of intensive bombing of aircraft factories and the appearance of new jet-powered fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262, suggested that time was running out for the strategic bombing campaign to achieve its objectives before German technological superiority made Allied operations impossible. The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. Each successful bombing mission required an average of 450 bombers and fighters, but German defenders were shooting down nearly 10% of attacking aircraft, meaning that bomber crews had less than a 50% chance of surviving a full tour of 25 missions, and replacement aircraft and crews were arriving at a rate insufficient to maintain operational strength. Fighter escorts like Romano's P-47s were limited by fuel capacity to penetrating only partially into German airspace, leaving bombers vulnerable during the most dangerous portions of their missions when they were approaching heavily defended targets like ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt or oil refineries in Ploesti. The situation had reached a critical point where some military leaders were privately questioning whether daylight precision bombing was feasible given current technological limitations, but those debates took place in Washington and London. Far from the cockpits, where young men like Romano faced life-and-death decisions based not on strategic theory, but on split-second calculations of speed, altitude, ammunition, and fuel. They were fighting a war where the old rules seemed increasingly inadequate for the new realities of mechanized aerial warfare. The mission briefing on the morning of March 23rd had been routine in its stark simplicity. Escort duties for the 351st Bomb Group, as far as fuel permitted. Then returned to base, while long-range P-51 Mustangs took over escort responsibilities for the final approach to the target at Schweinfurt. But Romano had felt uneasy from the moment he saw the weather reports indicating heavy cloud cover and strong winds that would scatter formations and create the chaotic conditions that German fighters exploited most effectively. His squadron leader, Major Robert Dutch Henderson, had emphasized during the briefing that fuel discipline was critical. The P-47s were already operating at the extreme edge of their range, and any deviation from flight plans would result in aircraft and pilots lost to fuel exhaustion rather than enemy action, a fate that offered no glory and served no strategic purpose. Romano had listened to these warnings while studying the mission maps and calculating fuel consumption rates, but something in the intelligence reports about increased German fighter activity troubled him. The numbers suggested that the Luftwaffe was concentrating unusual strength along the bomber routes, possibly indicating a major effort to achieve a decisive victory that would force Allied commanders to reconsider the entire strategic bombing campaign. As the pilots prepared their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, Romano performed his customary thorough inspection of his P-47, checking everything from tire pressure to ammunition loading, but his mind was already racing ahead to the tactical challenges they would face once they crossed into German airspace and entered the deadly game of high-altitude combat where altitude meant life and a moment's inattention meant death. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a Boston Irishman who treated the Thunderbolt with the reverence usually reserved for sacred relics, made his final report on the aircraft's condition while Romano climbed into the cockpit and began the complex startup procedure that would bring 8 tons of American engineering to roaring life. The Pratt & Whitney engine caught on the second attempt, filling the morning air with its distinctive deep-throated rumble, and Romano felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came with strapping himself into 18 feet of lethal machinery designed for one purpose: destroying enemy aircraft and protecting Allied bombers. He had no way of knowing that within 3 hours he would be forced to make a decision that would test everything he believed about duty, obedience, and the responsibilities of command in ways that no training manual could have prepared him for. The flight across the English Channel and into German airspace proceeded according to plan, with Romano's squadron maintaining perfect formation at 28,000 feet while providing top cover for the massive bomber stream below. But as they approached the Rhine River, radio reports began painting an increasingly ominous picture of German fighter concentrations massing ahead of their route in numbers that exceeded anything Allied intelligence had predicted. The 351st Bomb Group was flying deeper into German territory than any previous daylight mission, aiming for the Ball, bearing factories at Schweinfurt that American planners believed were crucial to German war production. But the cost of reaching that target was becoming apparent as radio chatter filled with reports of fierce fighter attacks and bombers going down in flames. Romano watched through his canopy as German fighters began probing the escort formations. Small groups of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s making high-speed passes to test Allied responses and identify weak points in the defensive formations. And he could feel the tension building throughout the fighter squadrons as pilots prepared for the inevitable major attack. The fuel gauges on his instrument panel showed that they were approaching the predetermined turn-back point. The mathematical calculation, that balanced escort effectiveness against aircraft survival, but Romano could see that the bomber formation below was already showing signs of stress. Aircraft falling behind with battle damage, formations loosening as pilots struggled to maintain position while under attack, and the distinctive black smoke trails that marked bombers whose engines had been damaged by fighter attacks. Major Henderson's voice crackled over the radio with the expected order. All P-47s were to begin their return to England immediately, leaving the bombers to continue under protection of longer-range P-51 escorts. But as Romano looked down at the vulnerable flying fortresses, he could see that no P-51s had yet appeared, and intelligence reports suggested that German fighter strength was at its peak directly ahead of the bomber route. The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. Without fighter escort, the bomber formation would face coordinated attacks by an estimated 200 German fighters, and historical data suggested that losses under such circumstances could exceed 50%, meaning that over 80 aircraft and 800 airmen might be lost in the next hour. Romano felt his hand tighten on the control stick as he faced the fundamental dilemma that confronted every military pilot: absolute obedience to orders versus the tactical reality unfolding before his eyes. The German attack began with textbook precision, waves of fighters approaching from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm the bomber gunners and scatter the formations. And Romano watched in helpless fury as the first bombers began falling away from the group with engines streaming fire and wings folding under the stress of damage that no aircraft could survive. Major Henderson's voice was becoming increasingly urgent over the radio, repeating orders for all fighters to return to base immediately. But Romano could see through his canopy the developing tactical disaster. The bomber formation was disintegrating under coordinated attack, with individual aircraft scattered across miles of sky and German fighters moving in for systematic destruction of isolated victims. His fuel gauge showed exactly 15 minutes of combat time remaining before he would be forced to dead-stick his P-47 into German territory. But those 15 minutes might be enough to even the odds if he could disrupt the German attack formation and give the bombers time to reach friendly fighter cover. The decision crystallized in his mind with mathematical clarity. He could obey orders and preserve his aircraft while watching hundreds of fellow airmen die. Or he could disobey direct commands and intervene in a battle where his single fighter might make the difference between tactical defeat and manageable losses. Romano keyed his radio transmitter and spoke the words that would change his life and ultimately reshape American tactical doctrine. "Dutch, this is Brick. I'm staying with the bombers. You can court-martial me when I get home." Before Major Henderson could respond, Romano had rolled his P-47 into a steep diving attack toward the massed German fighters, his 850 caliber machine guns already beginning to traverse toward targets that filled his gun sight with deadly precision. What happened next would be studied in tactical manuals for decades, but in that moment Romano was thinking only of airspeed, ammunition conservation, and the fundamental principles of aerial combat that his father had unknowingly taught him through years of patient construction work, that sometimes the most important job requires abandoning the original plan and improvising solutions based on immediate circumstances. Romano's first attack came out of the morning sun with the kind of tactical positioning that separated professional fighter pilots from merely competent ones, his P-47 diving at over 400 miles per hour toward a formation of German fighters that were concentrating on a damaged B-17 struggling to maintain altitude on 3 engines. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, usually considered a disadvantage in aerial combat, became a devastating asset in the dive, allowing Romano to build up speed that no German fighter could match while maintaining perfect control authority through the aircraft's powerful control surfaces and sophisticated trim systems. His first burst caught a Messerschmitt Bf 109 completely by surprise, the 850 caliber rounds tearing through the German fighter's cockpit and engine with devastating effect, and Romano felt the familiar satisfaction of seeing enemy aircraft pieces spinning away through the morning sky as he pulled up from his attack and immediately began scanning for his next target. The German formation reacted with practiced efficiency, breaking off their attack on the bombers to engage the lone American fighter, but Romano had already anticipated their response and was climbing back toward the sun, using his superior altitude performance to maintain tactical advantage while the German fighters struggled to follow him into the thin air, where the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine continued to produce full power. Technical Sergeant O'Brien had spent countless hours explaining the intricacies of the turbo-supercharger system to Romano, emphasizing how proper management of the complex mechanism could give the Thunderbolt decisive advantages at high altitude. And now that knowledge was keeping Romano alive as he maneuvered his massive fighter through vertical climbs and diving attacks that left pursuing German aircraft gasping for air in the rarefied atmosphere above 30,000 feet. His radio was filled with urgent calls from the bomber formation, gunners reporting German fighters breaking off attacks, formation leaders expressing amazement at the sudden change in tactical situation, and gradually the distinctive engine notes of additional P-47s, as other pilots in Romano's squadron made the same decision to disobey orders and join the battle despite fuel limitations that made their survival increasingly uncertain. The aerial battle that followed lasted exactly 14 minutes and 17 seconds, according to Romano's later after-action report, but in the compressed time space of aerial combat, it felt like hours of maneuvering, shooting, and split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died in the unforgiving mathematics of high-altitude warfare. Romano exploited every advantage that his deep knowledge of the P-47 could provide, using the aircraft's superior diving speed to make slashing attacks, exploiting its rugged construction to absorb battle damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters, and employing its devastating firepower to break up German attack formations before they could coordinate effective strikes against the bombers. His ammunition management was precise and professional, firing only when he had clear shots at optimal range, but each burst from his 8 machine guns sent streams of 50 caliber rounds that could tear apart enemy aircraft or force German pilots into defensive maneuvers that disrupted their attacks on the vulnerable bombers. The German pilots were skilled and experienced, but they had trained primarily for intercepting unescorted bombers and the sudden appearance of determined fighter opposition at a time when their intelligence indicated all American escorts should have withdrawn, created tactical confusion that Romano exploited with ruthless efficiency. Sergeant Jimmy Walsh, the tail gunner on a B-17 called Memphis Belle II, later wrote in his diary about watching Romano's P-47 destroy 3 German fighters in succession during a single diving attack, then climb back into the sun to repeat the performance while German fighters struggled to coordinate a response to tactics they had never encountered before. The psychological impact on German pilots was as important as the physical destruction. They had planned for systematic attacks on defenseless bombers, not individual combat against determined American fighters operating at the limits of their fuel capacity, with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Romano could feel his fuel situation becoming critical, but the tactical picture was changing in favor of the bombers, as scattered P-51 Mustangs finally appeared from the west, and he realized that his decision to disobey orders had achieved exactly what he had hoped, buying enough time for proper escort coverage to arrive and ensuring that the bomber formation would survive to complete its mission. The final German attack came as Romano's fuel gauge indicated less than 5 minutes of flying time remaining, a last desperate attempt by approximately 30 Focke-Wulf 190s to destroy the leading bomber formation before American fighter reinforcements could fully engage. But Romano positioned his P-47 directly in the path of the attacking fighters with a tactical boldness that bordered on insanity. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his fuel was measured in minutes rather than gallons, and his engine was running rough from combat damage sustained during earlier engagements. But Romano understood that this moment would determine whether his disobedience had saved lives or merely delayed inevitable disaster. The approaching German fighters were flying in perfect formation, led by an experienced pilot whose aircraft bore the distinctive markings of a veteran unit, and Romano calculated that he had perhaps 2 effective bursts from his remaining ammunition before he would be reduced to using his aircraft itself as a weapon. His attack was timed with precision that reflected hundreds of hours of training and an intuitive understanding of aerial combat geometry. He opened fire at maximum effective range, walked his bullets through the German formation with devastating effect, and then continued his dive directly through the center of their formation, while German pilots scattered to avoid collision with the massive American fighter that seemed determined to destroy itself rather than allow the attack to continue. Witnesses in the bomber formation reported seeing Romano's P-47 emerge from the German formation with visible battle damage, but still flying, while behind him the enemy attack had dissolved into individual fighters seeking to disengage rather than press home their assault on the bombers. Lieutenant Charles "Chuck" Morrison, flying as co-pilot on the lead B-17, keyed his radio to report what he had just witnessed. That crazy P-47 pilot just broke up their whole attack formation single-handed. I've never seen anything like it. But Romano was not thinking about heroism or tactical innovation. He was calculating glide ratios and emergency landing procedures as his fuel ran out completely and his Pratt & Whitney engine began the characteristic roughness that indicated imminent shutdown. His altimeter showed 18,000 feet. His position was approximately 40 miles inside German territory, and his options were limited to finding a suitable field for a dead-stick landing or attempting to reach Allied lines in a powerless glide that would require perfect piloting and considerable luck. The mathematics of unpowered flight in a P-47 Thunderbolt were not encouraging. The aircraft's massive weight meant that its glide ratio was approximately 8-to-1, meaning that for every 1,000 feet of altitude, Romano could expect to cover roughly 8,000 feet of horizontal distance, and his current position put him well short of friendly territory, even under optimal conditions. But Romano had spent countless hours studying every aspect of his aircraft's performance, including emergency procedures that most pilots hoped never to use, and he knew that by carefully managing his airspeed and exploiting rising air currents, he could extend his glide considerably beyond book values. The engine seized completely at 15,000 feet, leaving him flying a multi-ton glider through increasingly hostile airspace, while German ground forces undoubtedly tracked his progress and prepared reception committees for his inevitable arrival. Romano selected his emergency landing site with the same methodical precision he brought to aerial combat, a harvested grain field approximately 12 miles behind German lines, long enough to accommodate his landing roll, and flat enough to prevent the aircraft from nose-over that would crush him in his cockpit. His approach was textbook perfect, bleeding off airspeed in a carefully controlled descent while maintaining just enough speed to ensure positive control authority. And he touched down in the German field with a bone-jarring impact that collapsed his landing gear but left him conscious and uninjured in the cockpit of his wrecked P-47. German infantry reached his crash site within minutes, but Romano had used the time to destroy his radio equipment and classified materials, and when he surrendered to a Wehrmacht lieutenant who spoke excellent English, his primary concern was not his own fate, but whether the bomber formation had completed its mission successfully. The German officer, displaying the professional courtesy that sometimes existed between military aviators, regardless of nationality, informed Romano that Allied bombers had indeed reached their target and returned to England, and that his individual action had been observed and discussed by German pilots who expressed professional admiration for flying skill that had achieved tactical success against overwhelming odds. Romano's captivity at Stalag Luft III lasted 11 months, during which time he learned from other prisoners of war that his decision to disobey orders and remain with the bomber formation had indeed saved lives and aircraft. But more importantly, it had initiated a fundamental re-examination of American fighter tactics that would reshape the role of escort fighters throughout the remainder of the war. Intelligence reports filtering back through prisoner exchanges and resistance networks indicated that German fighter pilots had developed new respect and caution regarding P-47 operations, particularly the aircraft's ability to absorb battle damage and deliver devastating firepower, even when operating at extended range. The bomber crews who witnessed Romano's intervention had filed detailed after-action reports describing how a single determined fighter pilot had disrupted coordinated enemy attacks and demonstrated that individual initiative could overcome tactical disadvantages when applied with sufficient skill and courage. Major Henderson, initially furious at Romano's disobedience, gradually came to understand that his subordinate had identified a critical flaw in existing tactical doctrine, the rigid adherence to fuel management procedures that prioritized aircraft preservation over mission success, even when tactical circumstances suggested that calculated risks might achieve better results. Fighter Command began experimenting with more flexible escort procedures that allowed individual squadron leaders to extend their coverage based on tactical assessment rather than mathematical calculations alone. And these modified procedures resulted in significantly reduced bomber losses during subsequent deep penetration missions into German territory. Technical analysis of Romano's engagement revealed that the P-47's unique combination of firepower, durability, and high-altitude performance made it ideally suited for extended escort missions when properly employed, and engineering modifications were implemented to increase fuel capacity and improve engine efficiency for long-range operations. Romano learned about these developments through coded messages embedded in seemingly routine letters from his family, and he began to understand that his moment of disobedience had contributed to tactical innovations that were saving lives and advancing Allied strategic objectives, even as he remained imprisoned in German territory. The liberation of Stalag Luft III in April 1945 reunited Romano with Allied forces who informed him that his actions over Germany had become the subject of tactical studies and training programs designed to teach fighter pilots when individual initiative should override standard procedures, and that his combat techniques were being incorporated into official doctrine for escort operations throughout the European theater. Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle, commanding general of the 8th Air Force, personally interviewed Romano during his post-liberation debriefing, expressing particular interest in the psychological and tactical factors that had influenced his decision to disobey direct orders in favor of protecting bomber formations. Romano's detailed analysis of the engagement, compiled during long months of captivity when he had nothing but time to replay every moment of the battle, provided insights into German fighter tactics and American aircraft capabilities that proved invaluable for operational planning during the final months of the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt, largely as a result of tactical innovations pioneered during Romano's engagement, was transformed from a pure interceptor into a multi-role fighter capable of escort duties, ground attack missions, and air superiority operations, and its success in these varied roles contributed significantly to Allied air supremacy over Europe. Romano returned to the United States in June 1945 to find himself promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the Air Force Tactical School as an instructor in advanced fighter tactics, but he consistently deflected personal credit for tactical innovations that he attributed to the superior engineering of the P-47 and the courage of bomber crews who continued their missions despite overwhelming opposition. His post-war lectures to young fighter pilots emphasized the tactical doctrine must remain flexible enough to accommodate individual assessment of battlefield conditions, and that the most important decisions in aerial combat often required abandoning established procedures in favor of immediate tactical requirements. Romano married his longtime sweetheart, Maria Toretti, in September 1945 and settled in Dayton, Ohio, where he worked as an engineering test pilot for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base while raising 3 children who grew up listening to bedtime stories about aerial combat that emphasized teamwork, courage, and the importance of protecting others, even at personal risk. The long-term impact of Romano's decision extended far beyond individual recognition or tactical modifications. It fundamentally altered the way American military planners approached the balance between operational security and tactical flexibility, leading to doctrinal changes that emphasized mission accomplishment over strict adherence to predetermined procedures when circumstances warranted individual initiative. Fighter pilots throughout the Air Force studied Romano's engagement as an example of how deep understanding of aircraft capabilities combined with tactical intelligence and moral courage could achieve results that exceeded the expectations of standard operational planning. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself became legendary among both Allied and German pilots. Allied airmen appreciated its ruggedness and firepower, while German pilots learned to respect its high-altitude performance and the determination of its pilots to press attacks even under disadvantageous conditions. Romano's combat techniques, particularly his use of vertical maneuvers and energy management to maximize the P-47's advantages while minimizing its weaknesses, became standard curriculum at fighter pilot schools and influenced aircraft design requirements for post-war fighters. Intelligence analysis revealed that German fighter units had modified their tactics specifically to counter P-47 operations, developing new procedures for breaking off attacks when American fighters remained with bomber formations beyond expected fuel limitations, and this tactical adaptation provided Allied planners with valuable insights into enemy decision-making processes. The bomber crews who survived the March 23 mission because of Romano's intervention returned to civilian life with profound respect for fighter pilots who risked their own lives to protect others. And many maintained correspondence with Romano throughout their lives, crediting his courage with their survival and their ability to contribute to post-war American prosperity. Romano himself never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences until the 1970s, when military historians interviewing World War II veterans persuaded him to share his story for the benefit of future generations of military aviators. But even then he insisted that individual heroism was less important than teamwork, training, and superior equipment in determining the outcome of aerial combat. The technical legacy of Romano's engagement proved as significant as its tactical implications, as detailed analysis of his aircraft's performance under extreme conditions provided engineers with valuable data about the P-47's structural limits and operational capabilities. The fact that his Thunderbolt had absorbed significant battle damage while continuing to function effectively validated design decisions that emphasized durability over weight savings, and these principles influenced post-war fighter development for decades. Romano's fuel management during the extended engagement demonstrated that P-47 operations could be safely conducted beyond published limitations when pilots possessed detailed knowledge of their aircraft systems and maintained precise control over engine parameters, leading to revised procedures that increased operational flexibility without compromising safety. His ammunition management techniques, firing only when optimal conditions existed for effective target destruction, became standard training for fighter pilots and contributed to significantly improved kill ratios in subsequent operations. The psychological impact of Romano's decision on both Allied and enemy forces was studied extensively by military psychologists, who concluded that individual acts of exceptional courage could influence unit morale and enemy tactics far beyond their immediate tactical results. German fighter pilots interviewed after the war confirmed that Romano's intervention had disrupted their planned tactics and created uncertainty about American fighter capabilities that influenced their subsequent operations, demonstrating how individual initiative could achieve strategic effects through psychological as well as physical means. Romano's post-war career as a test pilot contributed to the development of jet fighters that incorporated lessons learned from P-47 operations, including the importance of high-altitude performance, robust construction, and heavy armament that characterized successful American fighter aircraft throughout the Cold War period. His influence on fighter pilot training emphasized the importance of understanding aircraft systems thoroughly enough to exploit capabilities beyond published limitations when tactical circumstances required exceptional performance. And this approach to pilot education produced generations of aviators capable of adapting to rapidly changing technological and tactical environments. The human cost of the March 23 mission provided sobering context for Romano's decision. Without his intervention, statistical analysis suggested that bomber losses would have exceeded 60 aircraft and 600 aircrew, casualties that would have seriously compromised the strategic bombing campaign and potentially delayed Allied victory by months. The survivors of that mission, scattered across post-war America, carried with them stories of how one man's courage had given them the opportunity to return home, marry, raise families, and contribute to the peaceful prosperity that their wartime service had secured. Romano received hundreds of letters over the years from former bomber crewmen and their families, expressing gratitude that transcended simple thanks and acknowledged that his decision had literally made their post-war lives possible. Many of these correspondents noted that Romano's willingness to disobey orders in favor of protecting others had influenced their own approach to moral decision-making in civilian life, demonstrating that military heroism could provide examples of ethical behavior that extended far beyond the battlefield. The 351st Bomb Group, whose survival Romano had ensured through his disobedience, completed its remaining missions with distinction and returned to the United States with one of the highest survival rates of any heavy bomber unit, an achievement that group historians directly attributed to the fighter protection provided during their most vulnerable mission. Romano's children grew up understanding that their father's wartime service had involved difficult moral choices that required placing the welfare of others ahead of personal safety or career advancement, and they carried these values into their own lives as teachers, engineers, and community leaders who emphasized service to others as the highest form of personal achievement. The annual reunion of Romano's fighter squadron, held every September in different American cities, became a gathering that attracted not only surviving pilots, but also former bomber crewmen whose lives had been saved by fighter protection. And these events reinforced bonds of mutual respect that transcended traditional military hierarchies and demonstrated the lasting personal relationships created by shared danger and common purpose. Romano's story became part of Air Force folklore, told in officer clubs and flight schools as an example of when individual judgment must override institutional procedures, but he consistently emphasized that his decision had been based on tactical calculation rather than dramatic heroism, and that similar situations might require different responses depending on specific circumstances. His post-war writings on fighter tactics stressed the importance of maintaining flexibility in tactical doctrine while preserving the discipline and training that made effective military operations possible, a balance that required constant attention to both individual development and institutional requirements. The P-47 Thunderbolt that Romano had flown to fame remained in German custody until the end of the war, when Allied investigators discovered that German engineers had studied its construction and systems extensively, providing valuable intelligence about American aircraft design and manufacturing capabilities. This captured aircraft, restored to flying condition by German technicians, was eventually returned to the United States and placed on permanent display at the National Air and Space Museum, where a placard describes Romano's engagement as an example of how individual courage and technological superiority combined to achieve Allied victory in World War II. Romano attended the aircraft's dedication ceremony in 1978, accompanied by several surviving members of his squadron and numerous former bomber crewmen whose presence testified to the lasting impact of his wartime decision. During his brief remarks at that ceremony, Romano emphasized that the real heroes of World War II were the bomber crews who flew repeated missions into heavily defended enemy territory, and that fighter pilots like himself had simply provided the support that those brave men deserved in their execution of the strategic missions that ultimately secured Allied victory. His humility in the face of public recognition reflected the values instilled by his immigrant father and reinforced by military service. That individual achievement was meaningful only in the context of collective effort toward worthy goals, and that personal recognition should never overshadow the contributions of others whose courage and sacrifice made victory possible. The broader implications of Romano's decision continued to influence military doctrine and ethical training decades after the end of World War II, as his example demonstrates how individual moral courage can achieve results that exceed the expectations of institutional planning while maintaining respect for legitimate authority and military discipline. His story is studied in military academies as a case study in ethical decision-making under extreme pressure, illustrating how deeply held values and professional competence can guide individuals toward correct choices, even when those choices conflict with direct orders or established procedures. The tactical innovations that resulted from Romano's engagement influenced not only American military doctrine, but also Allied air forces throughout the world, as the techniques he pioneered for maximizing fighter aircraft effectiveness became standard procedures for escort operations and air superiority missions. Romano's emphasis on thorough understanding of aircraft systems and capabilities as the foundation for effective combat operations became a cornerstone of fighter pilot training, producing generations of aviators capable of exploiting their aircraft's potential under the most demanding circumstances. His post-war career as a test pilot and instructor allowed him to directly influence the development of jet aircraft and pilot training programs, ensuring that lessons learned from P-47 operations were incorporated into the design and operation of supersonic fighters that would defend American interests during the Cold War and beyond. Romano died peacefully in Dayton in 1998, surrounded by his family and honored by his community as a man whose wartime courage had been matched by a lifetime of service to others. But his real legacy lies in the tactical doctrines, training methods, and ethical principles that continue to guide American military aviation toward the kind of excellence that protects democratic values and preserves peace through strength. The question that Romano's story poses to each generation of Americans is both simple and profound. When faced with the choice between following orders and following conscience, when institutional authority conflicts with moral responsibility, when personal safety must be weighed against the welfare of others, what choice would you make? Romano's decision on that gray morning over Germany was not the product of sudden inspiration, but rather the culmination of values learned from his immigrant father, reinforced by military training and applied through detailed knowledge of his aircraft and tactical situation. His willingness to risk court-martial, imprisonment, and death in order to protect fellow airmen demonstrates that true heroism often requires not dramatic gestures, but rather quiet determination to do what is right regardless of personal consequences. The P-47 Thunderbolt became every German pilot's nightmare not because of superior technology alone, but because of pilots like Romano, who understood that their aircraft was merely a tool for expressing the values and determination of the nation they served, and who were willing to use that tool beyond its published limitations when circumstances required extraordinary effort. The bomber crews who survived because of Romano's intervention went on to build the prosperous, peaceful America that emerged from World War II, but their opportunity to do so depended on the courage of one man who chose conscience over compliance and tactical intelligence over bureaucratic safety. Romano never claimed to be a hero, insisting throughout his life that he had simply done what his training and his values required in a specific tactical situation. But his example continues to inspire military aviators and civilian leaders who understand that individual moral courage remains the foundation upon which all lasting achievements are built. His story reminds us that democracy's survival depends not on perfect institutions, but on imperfect individuals who are willing to risk everything to protect the values and people they hold dear, and that the greatest victories are often achieved by ordinary people who find within themselves the extraordinary courage to do what is right when the stakes are highest. Would you have broken the order and stayed with those bombers, risking everything to protect others? Or would you have followed regulations and returned safely to base while good men died in the sky behind you? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means when everything depends on one person's choice to act beyond the call of duty and write history with wings, bullets, and unshakable moral conviction.